Okay, so here we go. Today, again, I am pleased to have Audrey Truschke with us. And Audrey, I'll just reintroduce her, even though she doesn't need an introduction. Audrey Truschke is a historian of South Asia, and she's an associate professor at Rutgers University in the United States of America. She received her PhD from Columbia University in 2012 and was a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Cambridge and Stanford University. And in 2015, she joined Rutgers University as an assistant professor of South Asian history. And in 2020, she was promoted to associate professorship. Some of the books that she's written, and I've read a couple of them. In 2016, she wrote The Culture of Encounters, Sanskrit at the Mughal Court. Then she wrote Aurangzeb, The Life and Legacy of India's Most Controversial King. Then in January this year, she released The Language of History, Sanskrit Narratives of Indo-Muslim Rule. In 2017, she was conferred with the John F. Richards Prize in South Asian History by American Historical Association for Culture of Encounters. But she has constantly been admired in a bit of controversy, especially with the Indian diaspora. In the previous year, Audrey's been accused of engaging in prejudiced commentary on Hinduism. In one of her tweets, she had referred to an episode in Ramayana where Sita deemed Ram as a misogynist pig. When questioned, Audrey asserted that she was following the critical translation of Valmiki Ramayana by Robert P. Goldman, and later on, Goldman rejected that he'd ever used such language, etc., etc. So as a result of her work, in 2021, a group of Hindu students of Rutgers University circulated a petition that called for Rutgers University to terminate Audrey's teaching assignments on Hinduism, condemn her prejudiced views, and create a safe space for Hindus. So iske liye bahut kuch hua, but in the end, she was supported by her university and, of course, a group of historians, including Romila Thapar, Rajmohan Gandhi, Sheldon Pollock, Partha Chatterjee, Suketu Mehta, and a lot of others supported her. And the university said that all this trolling and name calling that was happening should be stopped. And they've initiated some steps to confer with the Hindu students on how to make it better. And I have the pleasure of having Audrey here on Kehte Sunte. Welcome, Audrey, to Australia.
Thank you.
And of
Thank
course,
you. Thanks for having me, Manbir.
And of course, I've got Deepak Joshi from the Humanism Project, who's sitting in Melbourne right now at the unearthly 10:40 p.m. on a Wednesday night. But yeah, this was the only way to get hold of Audrey because, yeah. Audrey, let me tell you something. When I pressed send to that you were coming and I was inviting questions, and I sent that message on WhatsApp, within 15 minutes, a friend of mine wrote back to me and said, Manbir, thank you very much for being a friend, but I am unfriending you. I'm terminating our friendship because, you know, and obviously because I am headstrong and I am, yeah, so he was upset with me. How have you survived? I felt very upset that a friend of mine thought of terminating our friendship just because I had invited you to my show. But how have you survived the recent attempts to stifle your voice and the increased trolling? And I see it and I get angry and I get upset, but my sympathies are with you. So how do you handle that, Audrey?
Oh, thank you. Thank you for asking. And I'm sorry to hear about your ex-friend. So I guess I survive through a variety of mechanisms. Obviously, there's sort of self-care involved. There's people that I turn to. There's, in this most recent bout of attacks, there's a legal element as well. There's involvement of law enforcement, right? You know, death and violent threats, as well as online harassment, are all illegal under US law. Ultimately, I stand on the strength of my conviction that I'm doing my job as a historian. And this is not a popularity contest. I'm not here to get people to like me. I'm here to present aspects of South Asian history to those who are interested.
Hmm. Yeah, and that takes a lot of courage, and especially, I mean, being an inverted commas outsider. So the controversy with calling Ram a misogynist pig, I mean, even I would think twice of saying that. That's upset a lot of people. And then Professor Goldman denied that this could be interpreted by him the way you attribute it to. So what came of that? Did you have to issue an apology, or do you stand your ground? Uh, and that stems into this a common allegation that you are anti-Hindu and anti-Indian. Now, these are some of the tweets that came back when we posted about your sort of coming up to interview here. So a lot of questions there, yeah.
No, absolutely. So this is referencing a controversy back in 2018. So this is 3 years old now. And I published 2 articles, one in the Caravan and one in the Wire in the aftermath of those 2 tweets. So I do rest ultimately on those. I stand by what I wrote there. To help people understand, I guess I would say a couple of things. One is I think that context matters. I mean, that's a historian's standby. Context always matters. I was specifically commenting on a controversial cartoon, not done by me, but done by somebody else, that raised controversy precisely for similar reasons, because it was perceived to be somehow infringing upon or speaking disrespectfully to Ram. The irony then of me being attacked for the same thing has been lost, it seems, on many people. Ultimately, this comes down to a question of translation, which is much more mundane than, am I a raging anti-Hindu or something like that? But the mundane is often what scholars work with. The passage in question from Valmiki's Ramayana has been long described by scholars as Sita accusing Rama of misogyny. Okay, and that term that is straight out of Bob Goldman, right? You can check his introduction to volume 7 of Valmiki's Ramayana on that. The pig, that was me. Right. And that was a translator's choice. I was playing upon the well-worn English expression, as at least in American English, of calling a misogynist man a chauvinist pig, subbing in misogynist for chauvinist. I think one thing I learned in that controversy is that that expression did not translate so well into Indian English. And for that, I feel that it was a failed translation. And in one of the articles, I say that the translation didn't work. You can accuse me of being a bad translator. You can accuse me, certainly, of irreverence. I've never offered reverence for any religious tradition as a scholar. But I do reject very strongly the idea that many people have had that they are seeing my voice in that. I have never issued an opinion on Ram, and I never will. That's not how I choose to engage with Hindu traditions.
Yeah. So does that underline the fact that history should be written by the insiders, not the outsiders? I mean, if we are going to have, such basic issues of translating or transliterating, for that matter, and that gets misunderstood. I remember when Mrs. Gandhi was killed, and I was with. This is in 1984, and I was with some people, and I said, "Oh, she was impregnated with bullets." And they spread a rumor that I said she was pregnant, and it just got, again, drawn out of proportion. I got into a lot of trouble for that. But does that emphasize the fact that history should be done by insiders because they understand the nuances, they understand the sensitivities, and that's a charge that a lot of people weigh against you, that you're an outsider. Why should we listen to your history?
Honestly, the example you give me, Manbir, sounds more like an English issue, right? That reminds me of the cattle class controversy several years ago with Joshi, right? Which is, it's just, not knowing a certain kind of expression in a certain vein of English. Should it be done by insiders? So in terms of history, there are no insiders, right? When I'm talking about Valmiki's Ramayana, I'm talking about a text written more or less, give or take several hundred years, 2,000 years ago. There's no insider to that is in terms of it being a historical text. To me, relevant qualifications to comment on that would start with obviously knowing Sanskrit. So who's the insider, right? Now, in terms of religious traditions, things look different. There are insiders to religious traditions. And my line has always been, and my line remains. if you think that one has to be a practicing Hindu in order to comment on Hindu religious text, that is a perfectly valid insider perspectives. You should stop listening to me. Just forget about me entirely, right? No one has to listen to me. You need to understand that in saying you have to be an insider, you are electing for a theological set of perspectives as opposed to a history of religions and academic set of perspectives. That is the prerogative of every insider, right? What's inappropriate is when you try to take that theological set of ideas and an insider set of prerogatives and try to write that over and co-opt and silence the voices of people in the academy. That's the problem.
Yep.
I have a question, a related question to that. I mean, many of us who are not familiar with your background and your work would like to know about your journey, your early days, and how did you get to study South Asian history and then, Sanskrit and Persian?
Yeah, it's a great question. I fell in love with a Hindu religious text, academically speaking. That's honestly how this started. I went to University of Chicago as an undergraduate. I was 18 years old. I couldn't have identified India on a map. I knew nothing about the region of South Asia. And I was majoring in religion. Religion is one of probably the most longstanding interests in my life. And I saw a class being taught on the Mahabharata. And I had no idea what that was or how to say it or anything, but I looked it up and I was like, okay, it's a Hindu text. I should know something about Hinduism if I'm going to major in religious studies. And I know zilch right now. So I took the class and I was blown away. I had never encountered these views of multiple divinities and how they interact on earth with people, concepts of dharma and duty, a story that's never complete, that's always fluid and changing. I was completely amazed and enthralled. And I was also very confused. There were aspects that I just didn't get at all. And I identified, I think correctly, that was my problem. Like plenty of people understand and value this text in the world. And so essentially I wanted what they had. I wanted to understand. And I guess I'm still working on it 20 years later.
Fantastic. I mean, I'm sure Deepak and I are guilty of not knowing Sanskrit. So you score more than one over us there. So I just want to know about this very exciting, I haven't read it because it's pretty hard to get here. The language of history, Sanskrit narratives of Indo-Muslim rule. And you talk about that there were Sanskrit texts that sort of wrote the history around the time of the Mughals, and that the Hindu identity was a modern construction. I mean, we've heard of that it was a Persian Arabic term, Hindu, and it only appeared in Sanskrit in the 14th century. So tell us about some of those authors that wrote in Sanskrit during Mughal times, and what was were they paid by the Mughal kings, or were they freelancers, or what was their interest in writing Mughal history?
Sure. So the book actually starts in the late 12th century. So I start with the beginning of Indo-Persian or Indo-Muslim rule, basically with 1192. We have a Sanskrit text written in the 1190s about the Ghurid incursions into Chohan territory and the overthrow of the Chohans. And then I go into the early 18th century with the fracturing of the Mughal Empire. I cover about 36 Sanskrit texts, and they are written almost all over the subcontinent, literally from Kashmir down to Tamil Nadu, over to Gujarat, not over to Bengal. Bengal is the exception, and then I cover that in the conclusion of why I think that is. In terms of who's paying them, that really depended. By and large, with only one major notable exception, it was not the Indo-Persian or Indo-Muslim rulers themselves. The exception are the 15th century Raja Charanginis of Jonaraja and Srivara. Those were paid for by the Shahmiri kings in Kashmir, which is an odd situation to have Persian-speaking Muslim kings paying for official histories in Sanskrit, a language they probably couldn't understand or read. So that's an odd set of affairs. The authors they're diverse in other ways as well. It's about half Brahmins, half Jains. And that's an important aspect of the book, is bringing in Jains not as a footnote, because they're always a footnote, but rather as sort of full participants of the pre-modern Sanskrit literary tradition, as opposed to continuing to regurgitate a Brahmanical dominance over that tradition. So I push back on that. And then some of the guiding questions of the book I want to know what written history looks like in Sanskrit. It's a very old Orientalist trope that Sanskrit authors wrote everything under the sun except history. And I think that's not true. So I want to know what history was for them. And then I want to know what were their views of both themselves, because they weren't by and large calling themselves Hindu yet, and what were their views of the Muslim other, which as it turns out is not particularly Muslim and usually not other either. So it's bad phrasing. So, I criticize my own phrasing by the end.
How challenging is it? I mean, you spoke a bit about what you teach. How challenging is it to structure a syllabus, covering a very diverse region and a very widespread region ruled by countless, rulers and dynasties and over thousands of years of history. So it must be a challenging time to, structure or, curate your course that covers all of that or most of that or what's important in that. How do you do that?
That's a huge question. Yes, it's very difficult. I give a lot of thought and attention to this, like most professors. So let me use the example of history of South Asia. I teach this in 2 parts every semester. So I do the first 4,000 years in the first semester, the Indus Valley civilization up until right before the Mughal Empire is founded. And then in part 2, I do the last 500 years, the Mughals to Modi, informally. So one, you can't cover everything, right? Like you just can't. So you have to pick and choose. And I have some guidelines for how I do that. So there's certain things that students just love and that's important. So for early South Asia, the founding of Buddhism and Jainism are a good example. And I teach those in tandem, right? Like, I'm not going to cut that out. The Indus Valley civilization, right? People love the Indus Valley civilization. So I always teach that. Another consideration, however, is diversity. So I really try to teach both the diversity of voices in South Asian history. I always assign primary source readings for every single class, and I don't want them all to be by Brahmin men. So I try to get a diversity of voices, and that can be challenging for early India, especially. I also try to teach a diversity of approaches. So in the bad old days, we just, well, not me, I wasn't alive, but my predecessors in South Asian history used to just teach straight up political history, right? So, you had the Guptas, and then you had the Cholas, and then, you had the Delhi Sultanate and the Mughals and so on, and Vijayanagara and so on. And I certainly utter all of those names in my classroom, but I also teach social history and cultural history and literary history and religious history as well through an academic lens of history of religions. So I sort of toggle back and forth between all of those and then try to get students to see as many perspectives as possible. The last thing I'll mention that I've only really started doing during the pandemic, because that's only when I've been able to do it, is that I try to bring a diversity of voices into the classroom, because I'm just one person. And I tell my students all the time about historical debates, and some historians think X and some historians think Y. But no matter how much I try, there's a limit, right? My voice is one voice, even as I try to approximate and present the views of others equal to my own. So I've started bringing in guest speakers, because you can do that on Zoom. So I've had people join my class from India, from Australia, from across North America, and from Europe. And historians as well as non-historians, and give their perspectives on various aspects of South Asian history.
Fantastic. Sorry, I want to return back to your latest book, and you talk about the Sanskrit, the historians, but they did not see the Muslims that came in as the other. That I found that very interesting. But they had different areas where they criticized them for not knowing the language, for not being able to speak certain words. But they didn't hold that they were Muslims against them. And I want to dwell on that, and if you can clarify what that means.
Sure. So pre-modern Sanskrit intellectuals really cared about people knowing Sanskrit. This was like a super, super important thing to them. So when Indo-Muslim rulers show up and they don't know Sanskrit, this is hard. Like, you're a different religion. Like, there are lots of people of different religions around in South Asia. That's fine. But like, you don't know Sanskrit, like that is a huge issue. And a recurrent theme throughout several of the texts is precisely that Persian speakers cannot say retroflex sounds correctly. As someone who learned Indian languages as an adult, I really identify with that. Like retroflex sounds are very hard to pronounce. I still pronounce them with an accent myself, as I think most people who learn later in life do. But anyway,
can you give an example of something that you struggle with?
Let's see, like a Hindi term, like beta, like son, like, mera beta. I mean, I'm trying to do a retroflex T, but it's very hard because I didn't grow up with my tongue flicking back in my mouth like that, right? So anyways, so I identify on this and this alone with the Indo-Muslim guys who like roll into town. But in any case, for Sanskrit intellectuals, this was a sign that they were uncouth, they were unlearned, and they could not be proper kings for some of the early writers in particular, because kingship was tied up with Sanskrit. Now this changes. Later writers feel differently. They continue to be upset with like all this Persian chatter and nonsense that they're hearing. That long after Sanskrit intellectuals seem to care about any other kind of possible otherness presented by Indo-Persian rulers, they still seem to care about this language issue. So that persists. Although by the early 18th century, that does seem to have evaporated. And I close with my book with a pair of texts by Lakshmipati, who also goes by Lakshmidhara. And in his two works, he brings in a ton, hundreds, possibly thousands of words of Persian vocabulary. He even brings in bits of Persian grammar, like dar, which means in as a prefix, and ra, which is an accusative marker. And he uses it in Sanskrit, which, I mean, like this is like unheard of, like as someone, fairly widely trained in the Sanskrit tradition, it's very jarring to read this. Like you're not supposed to do that according to the traditional rules. But for him, by that point, over 500 years into having people who happen to be Muslim and their culture present in India, this is a totally normal, acceptable thing to do.
So in terms of religious practices, they did not see that these guys were different to their religious practices, or it wasn't held against them. I remember was it in Ashoka's time that they had a ministry for foreigners, and or around that time, and so were Indians more sort of forthcoming or accepting of foreigners and different cultures and different religious practices at that time than we are now?
That is a very broad question, and I don't know how helpful it is for me to answer it. I mean, essentially, it depends on your Indians, right? That's the easy answer. I don't think it's the case that Sanskrit intellectuals in pre-modern India didn't notice religious difference. I think they just, to some extent, it wasn't that big of a deal. And right, I mean, there's always difference that matters and difference that doesn't matter to people, right? But I also think that they saw it a little bit differently, right? So let me give you an example. There's a verse by Srivara, who's writing in 15th century Kashmir. He's writing a Sanskrit Raja Turangini, where he describes Islamic prayer. Okay, and it's a lovely verse. He talks about how worshipers sort of bow down and get back up again, and it looks like the rippling lines of a wave. It's a lovely Sanskrit verse. It's like a very well-worn, sort of metaphor in Sanskrit literature, rippling waves, sort of water going up and down, and yet it is a fairly accurate description of sort of conventional Islamic prayer. So I think for him, he noticed that it was different. Muslims were praying differently than what he was doing when he went to a temple, but he didn't see this as sort of threatening or a problem, or something that he could not find comparison with or explain within his sort of cultural milieu.
From the ruler's point of view, the Muslim rulers, what your books refer to how they took great pains to have some of the text translated from Sanskrit to Persian. Why did they feel the necessity to do that? Was there a reason? I mean, it shows certain kind of sensitivity they had, but was there a motivation? Was there a motivation to be accepted by the community at large? What was the reason behind that?
It's a great question. So this is really drawing on my first book, Culture of Encounters, where I talk about translations of Sanskrit texts into Persian. And I think your theory is one that a lot of people have held and probably still hold. Specifically, many have theorized that trying to gain acceptance on the part of the Mughals, either with the Hindu population at large or possibly with Rajput rulers specifically, is what motivated their translations of Sanskrit texts into Persian. Personally, I do not advance that argument in Culture of Encounters, and it's because I see a lack of evidence for it. The Mughals were emperors. This was not a world where like you needed to be legitimized in the view of the majority of your population, right? Like the Mughals didn't have citizens, is one way to put it. They had subjects, right? So I don't think, frankly, I don't think that they much cared what the majority of their Hindu population thought about them. That's generally true of pre-modern emperors and kings. I'm also not sure if you were trying to gain legitimation for some odd reason from your general population. I don't think translating a bunch of Sanskrit texts that they couldn't read themselves is going to get you there, right? The vast majority of pre-modern Indians were completely ignorant of Sanskrit, right? From the Rajput side, I don't see evidence there either. The Mughals were very interested in getting Rajput buy-in into the Mughal imperial project. But from my perspective, they advanced that through diplomacy where possible, and where that failed, through warfare, right? The Mughals were a land-based, land-hungry empire. They did not hesitate to resort to political violence in order to achieve their aims, and they hit hard against Rajput dynasties who, from their perspective, opposed Mughal interests. So for me, what does that leave? What I sort of theorize in Culture of Encounters, and I should say historians work in degrees of certainty. So this is an argument that I'm less certain of than other arguments, and I signal that in the book. But I theorize that maybe it was actually for them. Like maybe the Mughals themselves were the audience. And my idea is that the Mughals knew what it meant to be Timurid kings, right? They had a long Timurid lineage. They had a bunch of texts on what it meant to be Timurids. Like that was pretty clear to them. They knew what it meant to be Chagatai and, have that sort of Mongol heritage as well. But they had frankly no idea what it meant to be rulers of northern India. Okay, and the Mughals were limited to northern India during Akbar's period when the bulk of these translations take place. And I think possibly Akbar wanted to figure that out. And so if you start asking around, hey, people at my court, like what are like Indian texts, what are some resources where I might think about kingship? I think texts like the Mahabharata and Ramayana get recommended pretty quickly.
Okay, so we're going to go to a break, but before that, I've got a couple of questions from some of the people online who've asked. And this first question is from Dr. Fayaz Mohammed from Srinagar, Kashmir. And he says that often people talk about the 4,000 to 5,000 temples that existed in Kashmir and that they were demolished by Muslims in Kashmir. As a Kashmiri, I haven't heard of any such event or things happening on such a massive scale in our history ever. What is the truth? Tell us a little more about the history of Hinduism in Kashmir. I mean, obviously a potted history.
Yeah, so that's a hard one. So I was just saying, we have more historical resources in Kashmir on this subject than we do for a lot of other parts of India because of the Raja Charanginis. But as I often say to my students, just because somebody wrote it down hundreds of years ago doesn't mean it's true. Right? So I always give my students the example, like imagine 500 years from now, someone finds Donald Trump's tweets and reads those and just thinks that they're true. Like, do you think they would accurately understand, 2016 to 2020 US history? Like, I don't think so. So long story short, there are recorded instances in the Raja Charanginis of temple destructions. Historians are unclear how seriously to take those, right? Exaggeration was common in texts of this period for a variety of reasons. I would be comfortable saying 4,000 to 5,000. That seems way too high, right? There are some red flags there. Anytime you're dealing with round numbers in pre-modernity, it's somebody's giving an approximation. At the end of the day, though, historians work with positivist evidence, not negative evidence. So the onus is not on me to disprove. The onus would be on anyone claiming that number to begin to prove it through sustained, serious academic work. And I think that can't be done. which is why claims like that usually appear on social media or on WhatsApp and are accompanied by screaming if you fight back.
So he's also talking about the history of Hinduism in Kashmir and how powerful it was, and how widespread, etc.
Yeah, I mean, getting at sort of demographics on the ground, like if you want to know what percentage of Kashmiris were Hindus at a particular point in history, I've got nothing for you on that. I would say my own work for my recent book on 15th century Kashmir, and working on Jonaraja and Srivada's Raja Chiranginis, one thing that showed to me was that those authors particularly, they're not interested in Hinduism as we conceive of it as a broad-based religious tradition. They're interested in Brahmanical privilege, right? Like Brahmins are who they care about. They're not interested in a sort of broad-based Hinduism, which is not a criticism of them in any way, shape, or form. It's just an unvarnished and accurate representation of what they cared about. And whereas today, that strikes people as, problematic or, negative in some way, Jonaraja and Srivara were unapologetic about this. Like they were Brahmins, they wanted Brahmanical privilege, and any challenge or threat to that. That's what they were sort of laser focused on.
Okay, all right. So we're going to have a quick break, and we'll be back after this. Great. Yeah, so welcome back, listeners and viewers. So we are talking to Audrey Truschke from the Rutgers University. And I've got Deepak Joshi with me from the Humanism Project from Melbourne. And we've been talking to her about, of course, many vexed questions. And I was taking some questions from the field. So some people from far and wide have asked questions. So okay, Audrey, the second question comes from Shashi Chauhan. And of course, he's talking about how you've tried to whitewash, Aurangzeb's cruelty, etc. So some of the things that you normally get blamed for. But he's saying, what was the reason for the gruesome killing of Sambhaji Maharaj by Aurangzeb? If he was such a kind person, so what was the reason that the gruesome killing of Sambhaji Maharaj? Now, I'm at sea with this one.
Yeah, I really feel that I depicted Aurangzeb as a kind person when I titled one of my chapters "Destroyer of Temples." Oh yeah, I really think that I was depicting him as a huge teddy bear when I talked about his use of vicious state force. I mean, come on, this is a ridiculous set of allegations. People have clearly not read my book, right? If you want Aurangzeb as the teddy bear or whatever, like keep it in the WhatsApp world, my friends. To get to the specific question of Sambhaji, so Aurangzeb did not hesitate to use state force against enemies of the Mughal state, and that's, of course, he was the emperor as he perceived and defined enemies. And yeah, Sambhaji was very clearly an enemy. His father was Shivaji. Aurangzeb would have killed Shivaji if he could have gotten his hands on him a second time. He probably kicked himself for not killing him when he had him in his grasp in 1666. So Sambhaji was a dead man the moment that Mughal forces got his hands on him. There is a later story that comes up about Aurangzeb offering Sambhaji conversion right? Just convert to Islam and I'll let you live. And I don't think that story has any historical merit to it, primarily because there's no way Sambhaji was going to live, right? Like I said, he was dead the moment Mughal forces got him because he opposed Mughal state interests. Right? You did not want to run afoul of Aurangzeb Alamgir.
Yeah, and as you said, they were just there to rule. They didn't, these sensitivities were not there. Okay, so sorry, go on.
I had a question about Aurangzeb since we're talking about it. I think in your book, you have alluded that Aurangzeb was maligned more than he should have been, and his legacy needs to be reassessed. But why this bias against Aurangzeb? Akbar, for example, was someone who's always spoken in very glowing terms. So was there a reason then? It's not something which is universal or doesn't apply to all Mughal kings. Why pick on Aurangzeb? Is there a reason?
I mean, this, as other scholars like Ramila Topper has done this as well, like this really traces back to the colonial period. And the British were looking for rulers to malign in pre-modern Indian history. And if you're looking for people from a British colonial perspective, Aurangzeb jumps out. He's pretty recent. He was the most powerful of the Mughal kings. And he was the most Muslim by conventional ways of thinking about that, right? And then so anti-Muslim sentiments helped and played into that. The British maligned other pre-modern Indian rulers as well. It was not limited to Aurangzeb. He just became a sort of particular kind of poster boy for this sort of stuff. And then that has continued and then filtered on. And the same sorts of maligning that served the British pretty well in colonial India serves Hindu nationalists well today for slightly different reasons. So I think that's why it continues now.
Right. So this next question is from Sangram Gaikwad in Pune, and he's presently reading your language of history, Sanskrit narratives, and he thinks that's fascinating, and that you write in a clear and courageous way. And he's got a question for you, and he says that it's said by many that the concept of Hindu-Muslim composite culture in India is a result of formation of distinct categories of Hindu and Muslim in modern period. Has the idea or concept of Hindu-Muslim composite culture been dealt with by any of the pre-modern Sanskrit texts?
That's an intriguing question. I wouldn't use that terminology, right? So to posit a composite culture, as I think the questioner recognizes, you have to posit the existence of two separate cultures at the outset that somehow came together. So I might quibble with the vocabulary. But do any of them address that? Certainly the last guy I mentioned already, this Lakshmipati, I mean, he's bringing together sort of Sanskrit and Persian in interesting ways. He also has this interesting section where he talks about going on pilgrimage to Benares and how that's like a pilgrimage that Hindus do, and it's just like Muslims go to Mecca. And he goes so far as to say that there's like, just like we have the footprints of Vishnu in Benares, so too are there footprints of Vishnu in Mecca. So he takes that pretty far. So I guess that's one example I would point to. I would note that there are other ways of that different writers parse this as well. So a sort of counterpoint might be someone like Ganga Devi, who's writing in the late 14th century in Tamil Nadu in the Vijayanagara Empire. And for her, she's talking about the Madurai Sultanate, which was an independent Muslim-led kingdom, lasted almost 40 years, based in Madurai in southern India. And for her, like there's nothing Muslim about them. Like if it wasn't called a sultanate, I honestly would probably have no idea she was talking about Muslims, with the exception of a couple of like very small things. So for her, I don't know that there's composite culture so much as just like warm and welcome embrace within a more Sanskrit-based way of seeing the world.
Okay, so this next question is sort of, it beats me because I'm a layman, but this is from a person called Amitabh Joshi. And he's talking about on page 173 of the language of history, you mentioned that Padmasagra used Mudgal for Mughal in addition to Melcha. And he says he's curious how Mudgal came to be a synonym for Mughal, given that it's the early name of a well-known rishi. And he was born a Kshatriya and recognized as a Brahmin. And he's also apparently an ancestor of Drupad, the character in the Mahabharata. It is also a small town in Karnataka. So, And he wants to know about your sharing any insights or even speculations about how Mughal became a synonym for Mughals.
So this question, this renews my faith in humanity. It really does. So thank you to Amitabh. I really appreciate that sort of close reading. Like that's what we scholars work for years on and write so carefully is for readers like you. So thank you. So honestly, I hadn't thought of that. That's the honest answer. I had not thought of that connection. And I wish that I had, because I think of it elsewhere in the book. I talk about the word musula, okay, which there's another version, it's musula and then mausula. And this appears in Kashmiri Sanskrit text. And it's a sort of Sanskrit version of Musalman, right? So it's kind of the earliest Sanskrit, one of the early Sanskrit terms for Muslim. But musula is also the name of an obscure Pashupata sect known as early as the 11th century in Kashmir. Okay. And basically, I was never able to ascertain if there was supposed to be a connection there. Okay. Like Musula is not exactly Musalman, like you could have put that a different way, just like Mudgala is not exactly Mughal, like you could have dropped the D. So I mean, similarly, is there supposed to be an echo there of older usages? That's a question. Two, if there is there supposed to be carryover content? Sometimes, I mean, this is a strategy that people generally use in language. Sometimes you'll use an old term, even if there's not carryover content, because it just sort of rolls off the tongue easier. It sounds better to speakers of the language. And honestly, I don't know, but I think it's a really intriguing idea. And I thank you for the suggestion.
Yeah, maybe something for your next book, maybe. So this next question comes from Madhav Tiwari, and he's saying for many Indians, exists a dilemma that if we are defining the British colonial rule as a period of slavery, then why are we not doing the same with the Mughals, who also for them were outsiders, invaders, and had a different religion, and they favored Persian culture and spoke a foreign language. And he thinks that Hindutva is a result of not being able to address this problem. So my question is, based on history, what can be the Indian national imagination that can address this problem? This is Madhav Tiwari from Jaipur in Rajasthan.
So at the outset, I would question that narrative of where Hindutva comes from. I mean, Hindutva is a version of fascism, right? That this is a modern story. I don't think this has to do with anyone's inability to address history properly. So the easy answer is that there are huge differences between British colonialism and what the Mughals were doing. Okay, British colonialism, it was colonialism. The Mughals were not colonialists. They were conquerors, right, in terms of being a land-based empire. But the Mughals were operating in pre-modernity or early modernity, depending on how you periodize things. They never left. Okay, they weren't taking resources out of India and like sending them away to some faraway land. They weren't changing fundamentally the nature of wealth. They weren't extracting people and things. That's what the British were doing during the colonial period. So they're not commensurate. You can't compare them so easily in that sense. Whether you really want to describe British colonialism as slavery, that's an oversimplification, right? There are a lot of horrific aspects of British colonialism. Trust me, like the British have no defenders in their colonial enterprises except themselves anymore. But slavery that erases the some of the complexities of that period. The last thing I would say is I would urge people to check your biases on this. So the Mughals practiced a different religion. Really? There had been Muslims in India since the 8th century CE.
Oh,
right?
Really?
8th century. So, I mean, 700 years later, like how long do you have to be somewhere before you're integrated and welcomed, right? Like what happened to the whole India welcomes everyone storyline? They spoke a different language. Almost certainly by the late 17th century, more Indians knew Persian, including more Hindus knew Persian versus Sanskrit. Was it really a foreign language? Still, it had been around in India for hundreds of years by that point in time.
So when does Hindutva make its appearance exactly? I mean, where does it come into play?
Generally, the genealogy goes back about 100 years to the early 20th century. It really gets going in the 1920s. The founding of the RSS in 1925 is a sort of big moment that historians generally point to. The RSS is, as you know, it's a paramilitary organization. It was explicitly modeled off of fascist movements in Germany and Italy at the time. And that legacy, it was seen until pretty recently in the dress code for the RSS, right? The black cap and the khaki shorts and all of that. And it's still seen in the salute, right? That the salute looks Nazi-esque is not an accident. I think, of course, the biggest legacy of this sort of early modeling on fascist movements in Europe is just the nature of Hindutva and what it is, what its values are, what its ideology is, the proclivity to use violence, all of that.
Okay. Deepak, you got something that you...
Yes, I want to go back to your teaching work, Audrey. I noted that your latest book starts with the Faz's words, "Bol ke sach zinda hai ab tak, bol jo kuch kehna hai keh le," which is basically about truth telling, and I think it's your truth telling in your classes, in your classrooms, which is not trying to present a sugar-coated version of history that is probably causing some tension, and some of the students have said that they feel unsafe on campus because of that. So does that cause tension between you and your actual students, your South Asian, especially Hindu students? And if that happens, how do you deal with any conflicts that may arise as a result of that?
It's a great question. So I have never faced a student complaint ever by any student in my classroom in 15 years of teaching at 5 institutions at 2 countries. I have taught...
The petitioners, but none of them were your students, is it?
No, not so far as I know. As far as I know, there's only 1 student that's even at Rutgers Newark that's involved. Keep in mind, I teach at the Newark campus of Rutgers. I know that a number of students down in New Brunswick, which is a separate campus, seem to have strong views on what they think I am or am not doing in the classroom. None of those are actually my students, right? So I think part of what's behind this is just honestly some kind of wild imaginations about what I am or am not doing in the classroom. Most of my critics, they would be so disappointed, I think, honestly, to actually see me in action in the classroom, because it's not that exciting. Like, my biggest challenge is keeping my students awake, like most professors. Seriously, last semester, I had a student fall asleep somehow on the unmute button, and then it was like snoring. And I couldn't remute him because he was on the button, and we had to end the whole class and start all over. These are the problems I face. Like I said, I've never had a student complaint. Of course, I strive to create a very safe as well as an intellectually challenging environment for my students. And this is something I've thought a lot about, especially because I teach a notably diverse group of students. And that has to do with both what I teach and also the demographics of Rutgers Newark. We have the most diverse undergraduate student body in the entire United States of America. Out of 4,000 colleges and universities, we are the most diverse. In any given class, about half of my students are of South Asian descent, okay, but most have been raised in the United States, but not all. And then the other half are sort of, of ancestry and background of all over the place. And that's challenging, because I have students who actually know a certain amount about South Asian history. And then I have students who have never heard the word Pakistan before. Right, so I strive to teach to both. If there's one thing that might make my critics feel a little bit better about my teaching, it's this. When I teach South Asian history, I'm not teaching students what I think. Right, that's not the job of a professor. When I argue on Twitter, when I argue in publications, right, that's what I think. Those are my arguments. But in the classroom, honestly, I'm trying to teach my students a certain amount about South Asian history. I'd be really sad if, after History of South Asia Part 2, my students could not give me a few sentences on who Mahatma Gandhi was. That'd be really sad. But ultimately, what I care more about is how they think, right? It's the transferable skills, the ability to think critically, to read a primary source and not take it at face value, not just assume it's true, but be able to interrogate it and ask critical questions of it. The ability to compare scholarly arguments about a subject or time period in Indian history and come to your own conclusions and what you think about it. That's what I'm trying to teach my students. And then they can take those skills and they can apply it to anything they want. And some of my students will never think of South Asian history again once they leave my classroom. I know that. That's sad, but okay. And ultimately, if they want to think about South Asian history, I'm thrilled. I'm super happy, but they do the thinking. Right? I do my own thinking. I don't think for them. That's not, my job is not to do that.
So
Typically, a student.
Sorry, Deepak. So with this,
I mean, just on that, I was going to ask you. Typically, a student of my background, I mean, they may not complain, but have they ever expressed that, what you teach about or how you talk about characters of Mahabharata or about Ram is different, or from the way it's been taught to them as children? Or
oh, sure. Oh, absolutely. So I would say a couple of things. One is that obviously there are power dynamics involved, like many students might feel uncomfortable and not say something to me directly. We have a variety of mechanisms at Rutgers to deal with that. There's whole anonymous complaint things. We also do student evaluations at the end of every semester. We sometimes do them mid-semester as well. Those are completely anonymous, right? So there's plenty of opportunities to get, for students to comment without fear of, retribution or something. Another thing to note, so specifically on the epics, that's a great example. I have students in History of South Asia Part 1. I always have them read excerpts from the Ramayana. I can't have them read the whole thing because it takes too much time, and we have to get through 4,000 years. And I preface it with a whole discussion of, look, some of you have no idea what's going on and you're having trouble pronouncing the names, and we'll deal with that. But for some of you, you've heard some of these stories before, and maybe you've heard them in a different way. And I distinguish very clearly sort of faith-based ways of thinking about this from historical ways of thinking about this. From my perspective, I think that college for many people is a time where they're exposed to different views and different perspectives, and many students relish that. Okay, and my students, they're not snowflakes. Okay, they don't need to be coddled. They're fine. That said, I also think that students should come to challenges and approach those on their own terms, not on my terms. So I always offer students a way out. So when I teach Ramayana, I say, look, if you know different versions of the story and you don't want to know other versions, and for you, Ram being a god as well as a man who walked the earth at a particular point in time in history, believe that. Don't let a historian infringe on your faith and beliefs. Also understand that I am limited in what I can say about this text because I'm speaking as a historian. And I'm clear, you have to think as a historian in order to pass my final exam. But beyond that narrow framework, you want to think about the Ramayana in a different faith-based way, please go for it. No one's a historian all the time. I don't think is a historian all the time either, but I do so within the confines of the classroom.
So with this petition, Audrey, so you said there were no students part of that. Were there any recognized historians who signed that petition against you?
Not as far as I know. I would note no one that the petition, I mean, it's all alleged signatures. They've never released the list of names. I would say, given that this has been pushed by an anonymous Twitter handle, I don't know who's behind that handle. I'm confident that they're not at Rutgers because they keep being unaware of developments internal to the university. That combined with a lack of transparency on who signed this, I would say this is very much a sort of trust but verify situation.
So your subject doesn't, I mean, and it's an obvious one. So anybody these days can become a historian. I pick up 20 pages from WhatsApp and I know things. Right or wrong is different, but I've understood. So I can stand there and wax eloquent about the Mughals, for instance, because I'm not, what I'm saying is not going to be peer tested for that matter. If it's about sociology, I can do the same. But if it's something like engineering, how to build a bridge, I can't just go there and talk nonsense. But but
Well, you can, I just wouldn't cross your bridge.
That's right. But yeah, so with the democratization of knowledge, and the internet, I think, is to blame for that. Because and we constantly seem to be that everybody's an expert. You can write, people are talking about how to handle COVID. There are experts on that. People are, and people like me have access to a microphone and a camera, and we stand there and say anything and get away with it. How are we going to combat this dangerous path? Now, if I have to read history, I need to go to somebody who's spent years researching, getting knocked around by other people, having your thesis challenged, going to the primary sources. But at the same time, there are people like the Infinity Foundation, Rajiv Malhotra, who's consumed a lot of books on history, but I don't know if he's done any personal sort of research, but he gets a lot of audience, and he speaks at some very distinguished university functions. So how does that, where does that lead us to? As lay people, we're going to be terribly confused.
Well, I think my advice would be, think about the qualifications that you care about, and then look for those in other people. So if what you care about is hearing about aspects of Sanskrit literary culture and Indian history from somebody who is of South Asian descent, who is a man, who comes from a certain kind of background, and you really don't care about training or whether he knows Sanskrit, like, feel free to listen to Rajiv Malhotra talk about, Sanskrit untranslatables. Like, it's all untranslatable to him. Like, he's never studied the language. For me, that's not what I care about. I care about language training. I care about one's ability to read primary sources. I care about one's ability to read and parse secondary sources. I care about good faith intentions, right? And I actually want to know what happened in Indian history. And I want to know about aspects of Hindu traditions historically. I do not want to create a narrative that leads into my sort of modern preferences on politics, right? So I think essentially it's up to every woman and man to choose for yourself what you care about. And if you choose a set of qualifications that, disqualifies me, like you really want to learn about Hinduism from a practicing Hindu, that's fine. You just have to recognize that you're learning about it in a non-academic way, which is, again, that's fine. That's totally respectable. You just have to understand that people like me are going to be out there doing something a little bit different.
While we were talking, I got a question. So I'm just going to ask you this. And like you talk about the Sanskrit text and how the Muslims were not seen as outsiders. When did we start seeing them as outsider, and this rift started happening, that Hindus and Muslims can't get along? When did that rift, is there a period in time?
Sure. So I would say it's not that there's no Sanskrit view of Muslims as outsiders. Right? I mean, there are individual texts. Jayantaka from the late 12th century is a good example. Like for him, the Ghurids are irremediably other. But in terms of modern Hindu-Muslim conflict, I mean, I think we have to start in the colonial period, when we start to have Hindu and Muslim identities relatively close to how we understand those today. And I think that is true for both communities, that it's really strongly formed in the colonial period. Perhaps a little bit, it's easier to see that with Hinduism because of the absence of widespread use of the term earlier.
So Savarkar was right in what he said about the British policy of divide and rule. You seem to be echoing that they sort of changed the way we look at Aurangzeb, and they changed a lot of perspectives and sort of divided that rift quite strongly.
I don't think you're ever going to get me to say Savarkar was right, but yes, the British divided and conquered. I would point out that even at the time, the British didn't do that alone, right? British colonialism was never a British entirely enterprise. It always relied on the active cooperation of many Indians as well. Right? It's a more complicated thing than just the big bad British. And these days, the British haven't been around for over 70 years. Like I think the modern problems, obviously history always matters. We want to know where this stuff came from, but we want to know that insofar as it can help us dismantle it today. And that's work that needs to be done in the here and now in the 21st century.
Can I ask you a left field question? And you could totally laugh at me for asking that. But do we really need history? Say if we are here, for example, I'm sitting in Australia. As long as the laws are being passed, as long as we talk about ethics and laws and the present day situation, why do I need to worry about history?
Well, where are you going to get your ethics and laws from, if not from the past?
Is that not a human function, that we are naturally ethical, that we are naturally good?
So I would say a perusal of history might disabuse you of that notion that human beings are intrinsically ethical. A lot of horrors in the past. Mm-hmm. I think, what comes into my mind, I was teaching Ambedkar yesterday, and in one of his writings, he deals with this objection that for him, it's about religion, that all religions are good. Right? That's the objection. And Ambedkar's answer, he says, sure, all religions are good, but it matters how you define good. Like that's where the difference comes in, is what does good mean? So sure, maybe everyone's ethical, but really it matters how you define ethics. And I don't think we all agree on that.
Audrey, I had another question. Does your work, scholarly work, or your teachings, do they cover Adivasi or indigenous tribal history or traditions at all? And how much of that?
Yeah, the subaltern sort of, yeah.
That is a great question. In terms of my research, the answer is no. So I work on elite cultures, primarily in early modernity. That's what I'm trained to do. That's what I continue to do. But teaching is another matter, right? Because I don't teach my research agenda. I'm trying to teach, a relatively fair and balanced picture of South Asian history. So in that context, yes, I do try consciously to bring in Adivasi perspectives and issues. And I don't think I do a good enough job. That's an ongoing project for me, is to bring in more Adivasi perspectives. And then I'm still thinking about kind of ways that I can do that. But it also illustrates some of the limits, honestly, of sort of expecting one person to do it all. So I teach almost 5,000 years of South Asian history at Rutgers Newark. And I do that because if I don't teach it, there is no one else. I am the only South Asia historian at Rutgers Newark. I don't think that should be the case. I think it's insane to expect one person to teach almost 5,000 years of history covering 20 to 25% of the world's population. I think we should arguably expand our programming in this regard. But that's expensive, so we're working on that. But in the meantime, yes, I'm trying.
And continuing on that, have you also undertaken critical studies of South Asian, version or evolution of Christianity or Islam, as much as you have explored Hinduism?
So in my own research, no, I don't work on Christianity at all. I think I have an article about the Jesuits at the Mughal court somewhere, but that's about it. Other than that, Christianity is not among my research interest. Islam is, although I don't work on Islamic theology. Like I can give you a list of scholars who do, if you're interested in that. And I think that I'm glad you asked the question, because that this is a sort of persistent thing that comes back. The Audrey, why do you work on Hinduism? Why don't you work on Islam? Like why is there not equality? Scholars work on different things, right? I am a Sanskritist first, not foremost, but first. Like I learned Sanskrit first. My interest in Hinduism and Hindu text goes back much further in both my own personal study and in time in Indian history. And so if the accusation, but not by you, but by some, is that that's a sort of disproportionate influence in my scholarship, a focus within my scholarship, that's accurate, right? But scholars work on what they work on.
I was talking to somebody who sort of, again, objected to inviting you here. And he said, India is the only country where our histories can be sort of interpreted by anybody. This doesn't happen across the world. The British
That's
history,
ridiculous.
Yeah. So can you can you explain that? Because his idea was that, oh, anybody walks into India and then they sort of become experts just by doing that and telling us what India was, while we should be learning about Indian history from, again, the insiders. But is there any, I'm sure there's no sort of merit in that, but can you explain that?
No, absolutely. So I guess I would say two things. One, personally, I would distinguish me from there are people not of Indian descent who just walk into India and start writing, more popular books about it without knowing languages and things like that. That's a thing that exists. That's not me. Like, I trained for many, many years, and you don't have to think that that's valuable, but I do think it sets me apart from more popular writers on India. The second thing I would say is that this idea is just completely false, right? You can be of any descent and work on any history that you want. Okay, we have all kinds of people who work on US history that do not have Anglican names or something. I don't even have an Anglican last name, right? So, I mean, it's just this idea that you have to come from a particular background for everywhere in the world except India. This is just completely false. And historians, we don't think like this, right? What matters is your training and your arguments. It's not your skin color and your heritage.
Absolutely, yeah. And in fact, they deride even Romila Thapar, who is an Indian and who's got history, but even she is criticized at the moment for her interpretation of history. But look, that's all we have.
Manbir, can I ask one small, final, quick question? Has your study of Indian history and especially Hindu religion and philosophy and texts and scriptures, has it had any influence on you personally? Has it affected you in any way?
Yes, it has. And this is something, I've never been asked about this until the last month. So I tend to forefront scholarship in my professional work and not my personal life. But yeah, of course, it's had an influence on me. I would say my ideas about divinity and the nature of God have been significantly expanded in very fruitful ways by what I've encountered in Hindu texts and traditions. The concept of dharma and duty and kind of doing what you're supposed to do, and even while that's like kind of problematic in certain ways, I found that very productive for thinking about who I am and how to act in the world and how to be ethical. So yeah, I find great insight in Hindu texts. I would say all of that is on the personal side, right? And I do try to keep that separate from my scholarship. Not all scholars take that approach. There are other ways to mix one's, sort of personal identity and private religious life with what you do. Other people do that. I don't.
All right, look, thank you very much. I think it was a very interesting discussion, and we handled a few questions from far and wide. But Audrey, thank you very much. And I hope things sort of settle down and you can concentrate on your work, on your fantastic work that you're doing, rather than having to feel all these distractions. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Manbir and Deepak. It was great.
Yeah, thank you very much. Cheers. Have a good night.